Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be teaching at Dayspring on Sunday morning, March the 9th. In specific, those of you who are going to be teaching teenagers or adults on Sunday morning, March the 9th. This video is designed to help to acquaint you with the lesson you're going to be teaching and to maybe give you some ideas that will help you teach the lesson as best as you can. So if you've got your teaching transcript with you, go ahead and grab it. Grab something to write with so you can make some notes along the way. And I'm just going to talk with you through it and maybe give you some ideas, okay? So let's look at it. On page 1, you've got a lesson overview. And you'll notice that the lesson overview, you're going to be teaching out of Mark chapter 12 this week. And this is all about the fact that Jesus, he understood the principle well, that if you want to really teach the right thing, sometimes you just need to put yourself in the right place at the right time so that you can teach the right thing. And Jesus does that on this occasion in Mark chapter 12, where Jesus shows up where people were giving offerings, because Jesus was wanting to teach his disciples about what we've been talking about, living as the possession of God, living as one who is really owned by God, putting ourselves in his hands. And Jesus takes this occasion to teach something about what it looks like when God owns what we think that we own in our material possessions and those sort of things. So this is a lesson about that, and that's kind of explained there on page 1. Now look on to page 2. There's an introduction here. Now, let me say this about this introduction. You may or may not use it because, it may be one that you are or are not comfortable with. Now, here's the point you're making in this introduction, that, Jesus understood that sometimes to get the right end result, you just really need to put yourself in the right place at the right time. Well, this opening illustration is one about, and you may have heard about this, I think the illustration's hilarious just because of the opening line, all right? Look at the opening line. The Girl Scouts of California are going to pot, literally. And then it goes on to explain this news story about these Girl Scouts who went to set up to sell their cookies outside of a medical marijuana clinic because, as rumor would have it, that when people are using marijuana, they kind of want a snack and they get the munchies. So these girls set up outside a medical marijuana clinic, sold their Girl Scout cookies, and sold way more cookies than they normally do. All right? Now, again, that story is just kind of a humorous story, I guess, about that when you put yourself in the right place at the right time, you can get the right end result. Now, if you feel comfortable segueing from that story into the story about Jesus setting himself up outside the temple to teach something very important to his disciples, then use the illustration. That illustration, if it fits your personality and your way and the style of your class, use it. If you're uncomfortable with it, skip it. Now, I would say this, that if you're teaching one of the groups for teenagers, just don't use the illustration at all, okay? Because students, non-adults, they have a harder time deciphering and discerning humor from reality and all of that. So I think it's just best overall, if you're teaching middle schoolers or high schoolers, don't use the illustration where you're trying to make jokes about marijuana, okay? We just don't want to do that with our students. But if you're an adult, that illustration might prove beneficial, or it's a good icebreaker or whatever. If you like it, use it. If you don't, don't. If you don't use it, I would just say something like, Jesus really knew how to make a point. And he knew that if you put yourself in the right place at the right time, you could really make the right point. And we see him do this one day in Mark chapter 12, and then just dive right in, okay? Now, to teach your lesson on page 3, this is where you're going to start teaching your text. It normally would say that at the top of this page. I noticed that it doesn't, but this is where you're going to start teaching your text on Mark chapter 12. Now, there's some information on your transcript, kind of giving you some context about what's going on at this time in Jesus' life and all of that. Then you're going to read the text, Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Again, this is the passage where Jesus shows up outside the temple as people are giving their offerings to God. And there's some great background information there, kind of telling you about kind of where he would have been sitting and what he would have been seeing. Some great stuff in your transcript there. I'm not going to read all that to you. You can do it. But there's a great teaching tip there on page 3 that I would pay attention to if I were you. Because in this passage, it's going to talk about how Jesus commends this widow because she gave everything. That's the word that he uses. And sometimes what we can do is we can take Jesus' words, like when he makes a real extreme point, Like, this lady gave everything. Sometimes we can take that and say, well, that's just kind of hyperbole, and what that means really, actually, and we kind of redefine what he's saying. Don't do that. It might just be every now and then that Jesus actually means what he says, right? And he commends this lady because she gave everything. So don't minimize that, and don't try and explain it away, because that's actually the whole point of this thing. So let's look at this together on page 4. On page 4, here's the first point, and look at it. That God is more concerned with the size of your faith than the size of your offering. Now, that's the first point that Jesus is making in telling this. It's not the size of your offering that counts. It's the size of your faith. And of course, those things are going to be interlinked, but that's the point that Jesus is making. It's the size of his of faith that he's looking at. Now, 2 subpoints here. One about the point that Jesus wasn't making, and one about the point that Jesus was making. Here's the point that Jesus wasn't making. Jesus wasn't making a point, and this is on page 4. He's not condemning the offerings of the rich, okay? Now, we kind of look at it sometimes and we'll say, well, Jesus is talking negatively about the rich. That's not necessarily the case. And the reason that we do that is because we don't identify ourselves as those rich guys. And since we don't identify ourselves as them, it's easy for us to say, well, then let's talk bad about them. If we thought we were them, we wouldn't even think that he was talking bad about the rich people's offering. So make sure that you don't talk about the fact that he's kind of dogging them. He's not necessarily. Now, there is a Matthew 6 passage that you're going to read where it does illustrate that Jesus on some occasions does criticize the offerings of the rich, but it was because that some would give big offerings for the purpose of exalting themselves and drawing attention to themselves. Now, when that happened, Jesus dogged out their offerings and said, what they're giving, that's not good. But in this particular instance, Jesus doesn't necessarily condemn the offering of the rich. So what is he doing? He's simply doing this. Look at the bottom of page 4. This is your second subpoint. What he's saying is that the widow's offering was better. The quality of their offering, he doesn't necessarily define so much. He points it out. They were giving large amounts. His point was not that their offering was bad. His point was simply this: her offering was better. Okay, so that's the point. Now, why is that? Why was her offering better? Move on to page 5. A couple of subpoints under this subpoint. Here it is. Her offering was better because, number 1, she gave until it hurt. She gave until it hurt. And Jesus actually is the one who explains this for us. He answers the question, why is her offering better? In verse 44, he points it out, because she gave everything that she had. She gave until it hurt. Now, there's a great detail that Luke points out to us in this passage that we don't need to overlook. Luke points out specifically, and look at it, in verse 42, he says she put in 2 very small copper coins. She gave 2 coins. Now, here's why this is significant. Jesus said that she had 2 coins, and he points out that she gave 2 coins. Now, think about this. If she had just given 1 coin, if she owns 2 coins and she only gives 1, that's still a pretty hefty offering in terms of the size and proportion of her offering. She just gave away half of her wealth as an offering. That would be impressive, right? I mean, if somebody gave half of their stuff to God, that's impressive. But Luke points out specifically, she put in 2 coins. 2 coins. She could have given 1, and that would have been impressive enough. But she gave both. She gave everything that she had. Now, that's something. She gave until it really hurt. And there's some great teaching things on page 5. I'm not going to read to you. You can read those on your own. But this brings us to the second subpoint at the bottom of page 5. Because she gave both coins, look at this. Her offering was better because, number 1, she gave until it hurt. But secondly, because she had no choice but to depend upon God. Think about it. She had no choice but to depend upon God at this point. If she had kept half of it, she would still have to depend on God a lot. But now she had to depend upon God totally. So Jesus puts his disciples at just the right place at just the right time so that one day they're going to see some rich people giving some offerings, and then they're going to see this widow give both the coins that she has. And Jesus' point wasn't that the offering of the rich wasn't good. They may have been good, but his point was that hers was better. Her offering was better because she gave deeply until it hurts, to a point that she had nowhere to go but to depend upon God. And Jesus says, this is a kind of offering right here that really captivates me and captures my attention. Now, as you move on to page 6 on your teaching transcript, you'll notice there's a real hard dividing line that's been put into the transcript. That's because this is kind of a breaking point in the lesson. You've taught the text at this point. Now you're going to make this closing point. And look at the closing point. Closing point is that Jesus, here's what we learn from it. Jesus wants us to give like the widow gave, which means he wants us to give until it hurts. All right? He wants us to give until it hurts. And we might look at a lesson like this and say, okay, I know this is talking about money, and now we're just saying that he's aiming at our wallets. That's what the teacher's doing here. He's aiming at our wallets. But there's a great paragraph there to close this thing out. This is aiming way beyond our wallets, okay? This is aiming at our hearts. And if Jesus were sitting with us today, and this is all spelled out in your transcript. In fact, let's just look at it. I'm going to read it with you. Right under that bold statement, it says, now before we make the assumption that this is a statement about money and giving to the church or participating in the vow or something like that, realize that it's much broader than that. The reality is that our church has been very generous and faithful in those kind of giving opportunities. Look at the next paragraph. When we hear a statement like, we need to give until it hurts, we automatically assume that statement is aimed at our wallets. But I think the best application of this passage is found beyond our wallets. If Jesus were sitting with us here in this room today and summarizing what we should learn from this, I don't think he would say, this year I want you to spend your money a certain way. I think he would say, this year I want you to spend yourself. Boy, think about that. I want you to spend yourself. Jesus, if he could sit with us in this room today, better yet, make this point. If he were sitting in this room with us a year from today, I think he would want us to be able to look back and say, you know what, over the past 12 months, I have given myself fully to God. I have spent myself for God and his kingdom purposes. And we learn this from this widow. What she did with her money teaches us about what we ought to do with not just our money, but with our lives. We ought to spend it to a point to where it hurts and we have nowhere to go but to God and to depend upon him. So that's the lesson that you're going to teach. Now, application is critical. Remember, if we're teaching lessons and people aren't applying it, then we're wasting time. We're wasting our time. We're wasting their time. If they don't apply it, then we haven't done our job. And I think that all of the application in this lesson, I think where this lesson's really going to stick is what happens after this in the application moment. When you do the group handouts and you distribute those and people cluster together and talk it through. So look at this handout. I want to show you a couple of things on the group handout. It's on page 9 of your teaching transcript. It's the last thing on your teaching transcript. 4 questions that your group members are going to work through in clusters. And I want to just kind of walk through each of the 4 with you for a minute, okay? Number 1, look at this first question. It says, have you ever done something that seemed irrational or illogical, but you knew it was God's prompting? How did that turn out? Share your experiences together. So this is a really important thing for your group to talk out together, because people are going to get to speak and hear times when someone did something that seemed really tough to do, but they knew that God was leading them to do it. They're going to hear testimonies of how God comes through and all of that. So that's discussion point number 1 on the handout. Number 2, look at this one on the handout. It says the main point of today's lesson was that we need to be willing to spend all of ourselves for God, and that all of us involves several individual compartments, doesn't it? Name the various compartments of life that make up the whole of our lives. And then ask this question, which of those are the hardest parts for you to hand over to God and turn over to God? And what makes that particular thing so difficult? So at this point, people might say, well, you know, when I talk about the sum of my life, I've got family, I've got finances, I've got work, I've got, you know, they may name all kinds of compartments and parts of life. And the question is, of all of those compartments of life, which seems to be the hardest? Just to let God take full possession of it and to live as if God owns it, okay? So folks are going to talk about that together. Now, here's the bulk of it. Discussion point number 3. Look at this. It says to read this week's memory verse. And this week's memory verse is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. Look at it at the bottom of your handout. Just as you excel in everything, this is Paul writing to the church, just as you excel in everything, in faith, speech, knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in love, see to it that you also excel in this grace of giving. So Paul says, boy, you're excelling in a lot of things. Now I want you to excel in the way that you share your stuff with each other too. Now look at this. Three great things that your group's going to discuss here. It says, based strictly on this verse, and you may need to help explain this to those clusters of people, okay? Based strictly on this verse, answer the following questions. Look at these 3 questions. Number 1, is it possible to excel in certain parts of your Christian walk, yet stay stagnant in other parts? Now, think about this question in light of this verse. Is it possible to excel in certain parts of my Christian faith, yet remain stagnant in this compartment? Well, based on this verse, I would say yes, because Paul says, look, you guys are excelling in all sorts of things. Knowledge, concern, compassion type things. You're excelling in all of this, but now you know what you need to do? You also need to excel in how you're sharing your possessions with one another, your stuff. So based on this verse, sure, maybe we can excel in certain parts of our Christian faith and not quite be up to speed in other parts. All right? Look at the second question. Again, based strictly on this verse. Really drive this home with your group, okay? Strictly on this verse. Does it seem that excelling in our giving is the easiest and first thing we do as Christians, or one of the most difficult or last things to do? Again, based on this verse. Based on this verse, it seems that it's one of the things that many people are going to have to catch up on in terms of catching up with the other things. It seems based on this verse that there will be people who can really get good at participating in church life in terms of attending, maybe get good at serving and serving people. They may be a good neighbor, like State Farm. They might be a good neighbor and helping out with their neighbor and doing all sorts of things. But opening their hands with their dollars might be the last thing that kind of happens. So you may have people who are actually good at being unashamed of sharing their faith with people at work. You may have people who are good at showing up at being at church all the time and doing all sorts of things, but yet they haven't learned to excel in the grace of giving. So again, based strictly on this verse, is giving one of the easiest and first things we tend to do as a Christian, or one of those things that many are going to have to grow into with other things? Well, I'd say for some it's going to be something they grow into. Then the last question, again, based strictly on 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6, it says, Jesus made it clear that we shouldn't broadcast our generous giving in order to be praised by men. So is there any room for human accountability or encouragement when it comes to excelling in our giving? I don't necessarily have a specific answer there for you. I would be curious to hear what people say there. Jesus made it clear your giving doesn't need to be about you. It doesn't need to be trumpeted and all for your glory and all of that. But is there any room for encouragement and even accountability in our generosity? I don't know. I mean, we are reading a letter where Paul's saying, I kind of know a little bit about the way you give, and I'm encouraging you to give better. Is there room for it? Again, I don't have a specific answer there. I'd be curious to hear how you guys discuss that question, all right? There's a final question there on the handout, number 4. I'll be shocked if your group makes it through this handout, by the way. That's why your lesson isn't horribly long, your teaching portion. But look at this 4th one. It says, look back one more time at what Jesus said about the widow in Mark 12, verse 44. And just a reminder, what he said was that her gift was best because she gave everything that she had. I mean, she gave until it hurt. She gave it all. Her offering was better in that way. Now look at the question. If Jesus is going to say that about you this time next year, what are some baby steps that you need to start taking to move in that direction? Man, that is a great question, especially if you're teaching at the 10:30 hour. That's a great discussion question, because that is going to pick up right where we leave off. Because there's going to be an application point really in the sermon about how we need to be intentional, and we need to be strategic and intentional and have a plan about how we offload some of the stuff that we have. This question leads us into that. What are some steps that we can start taking? So really the application of this whole lesson all comes right there on discussion point number 4 on the handout. And that's also where the sermon that I'm going to be teaching, this is where that application is going to start fleshing itself out in people's lives. So really make sure people have time to do this handout, okay? Don't teach for an hour and leave them like 3 minutes to do this handout. Teach through the lesson in a reasonable amount of time. The lesson's not real long. Then distribute those handouts, and man, let them talk it out. Let them work it out. Let them write things out, and let them walk away knowing, here are some baby steps and some goals that I need to have in my life, so that this time next year I can say, boy, I've really given all of me to the Lord, and I'm not living in such a way that what I own, that I actually own it. This is the possession of God. All right? So this is your lesson. Obviously, you have a conclusion there that you can wrap it up with, a great reminder about what it looks like when we give beyond our means, really, in the sense that we step out on a limb for God and we live our lives in such a way, not just with money, but our lives in such a way that He's going to have to get the glory for it. Because if He doesn't come through, He's going to be the only one who can get the credit. And that's what we learned from this widow. She gave to a point to where it hurt. And she gave to a point where she had to depend upon God. Only He was going to get the credit for taking care of her. So let's learn from her, and let's not just learn from her, but let's live as she lived, because Jesus said what she did, this was the best way to live. All right? Hey, thanks for listening in. I hope that you got a couple of pointers here for your lesson. I'm going to be praying for you as you teach and lead this Sunday, and I look forward to seeing you then, all right? God bless you.